How far should Christians go in support of equity? What's up, my friends? I pray you are standing strong in your faith as you continue to get equipped in God's truth so that you can engage the culture with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, on today's video, I want to be talking about what type of equity should Christians support. You see, there's a lot of talk these days about equality and equity. It seems like everywhere you turn, on the news, wherever you get your information online, you see the tweets out there, you see even posts on Instagram, all these different memes. You got politicians, you got movements like BLM. You have all these people talking about equality and equity. You have people protesting and taking out to the streets. And for the most part, people are like, well, I get equality. That makes sense. But what about equity? Like, what's the difference? And is it all good, or are there some things that are bad? Well, simply put, equality is literally just treating everyone the same. And now you and I get that. That's fundamental to Americans and to human beings in general, objectively and universally around the world. As a Christian, I believe that we're all made in the image of God. The Bible says in Galatians 3, verse 28, that there's neither male nor female. The Bible also teaches us in Romans 2, verse 11, that God shows no partiality. What that means, neither male nor female, and that God shows no partiality, is that we are created equal. Okay? Maybe of a different sex, maybe of different gender, you may be a different ethnic, group. You belong to a different ethnic group. You may be even of a different social economical status. Your background's completely different. You come from a different nationality. You come from a different country. You come from a different time period. You're a different age than some people. You went to a different school. But guess what? We're all created equal. So we get that. But what happens now when you start throwing this term equity into things? You see it in politics. You see it in policy. You see it in education. You see politicians talking about it. We need more equity here. We need more equity here. You see even athletes, people like LeBron James, you see people posting about it. And the question is, what is it? And specifically as a Christian, how much of it are we to support? Well, let me show you a quick little definition, and I'm going to give you a second one to follow up. The first one comes from Premier Talent Partners, and they simply say equity means justice according to natural law or right. Okay, I think that's a little confusing to understand, but for the most part, what they're saying is equity is a justice act, and it's something that actually supersedes a human being. So, meaning we believe it to be true because it is objective, not just subjective. Notice, or the quality of being fair and impartial. So the question here they ask is, so what does this mean in the workplace? It means that treating everyone the same in the pursuit of equality might not actually be fair. So they're admitting that there are going to be situations where in order to treat somebody fairly, you have to treat somebody unfairly. But hopefully in cases of equity, the person who's being taken from is because they have a lot. And so that's why in the end, it's not really a bad thing, because we're giving to someone else who's less fortunate. And if I'm going to help this person excel up and to arrive at the same place as somebody who is fortunate, who has a lot already, and this person continues to get more and more and more and more and more, while the person who has less, less, and less and less is never going to arrive at the same place. And so equity is saying it's equal outcome. That's what they're trying to achieve. And so that in itself, you guys, is where Christians should not be supporting equity. Let me give an example. I'm going to give you this definition because this is definitely a definition that a lot of people are using these days, and it comes from Winston-Salem University. Notice, quote, equality is typically defined as treating everyone the same and giving everyone access to the same opportunities. Meanwhile, equity refers to proportional representation by race, class, gender, etc. In these same opportunities, to achieve equity, policies and procedures may result in an unequal distribution of resources. For example, need-based financial aid reserves money specifically for low-income students. Although unequal, this is considered equitable because it is necessary to provide access to higher education for low-income students, end quote. So in essence, I'm going to leave the definition up here for a minute, because I'm going to give you guys now 4 points of how we can process through equity. In essence, what they're saying is equity trumps equality. There will be times in order to fulfill the quality of equity, you have to undermine equality. So you catch that. In order for the quality, that's in more or less the justice of equity, so something to be equitable, and the quality of that has to undermine or take from equality. So it becomes an inequality for something to be of an outcome that's equitable. See, that's complete and total contradiction. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. Now, let me show you this image because this is what a lot of people use to explain what they mean between the difference of equality and equity and how they're being used. Notice quality, everyone gets the same box, same size box. But the problem is not everyone's the same. So what do? Well, equality says, hey, take the box. Again, remember, it's not the man who's tall on the left in the orange pants who gives the box. Society says, most cases, this is going to be government. Take the box. We don't ever give the guy the box, but we immediately give 2 boxes to the kid who's the shortest, so that way he can see past the fence. Now, there are major problems with that meme to justify or to clarify what they mean when they say equity versus equality. And I'll get to that in a minute. Now, before I do address these 4 points, I want to say something. When it comes to equity in our society, and this is something I talk about in Challenging Conversations in my latest book, so I encourage you guys to pick up that book because this will help you with controversial topics of how we can appropriately and winsomely and objectively and critically respond to a lot of issues. Even though I believe equity is being dangerously used in our society, I do think it's important to say first that we're not to overlook that there are people who have disparities, there are people who are in need. All right? So just because there are forms of equity that I do not agree with, that is not to say that I'm not here to help people. So don't fall into that trap. Another thing to say in this whole debate over diversity, inclusivity, and equity, there are people, guys, who genuinely, even from the left, from a position that is contrary to mine, that's the opposite of mine, I do believe, because I do have conversations with them. Matter of fact, I just received an email recently from a progressive leader who wants to have an open debate. We're trying to figure out what that's going to look like. We may start private, and maybe I may interview him on my channel. Who knows? But he's genuinely trying to unite people, and he's trying to offer help where help is needed. That's a good thing. So let's not discredit that either. But let's not be fooled, however, into believing to do that, we must embrace the left's dangerous view of equity, hook, line, and sinker. Just because there are those who have less than others, just because there are inequities in the world, my friend, doesn't always mean it's unfair and that the government always has to step in there as some type of social justice system that needs to put everybody else on the same playing field. No, the founders, our founding documents never intended, nor is it biblical, for the government to be used by putting everybody on the same level field. No, we're not all the same. We said that. We're equal in human nature, but we're not all the same. We can't put everybody on the same playing field, same level playing field, so that everyone ends up at the same place. That, my friends, is not reality. Therefore, it's not equality. That's important. So let's dive in to these 4 points now. The first point that I want to draw your attention to when we're distinguishing between equality and equity and where Christians should be supporting equity, we cannot be supporting these inadequate treatments. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I mean this. No one is denying, again, that there are disparities among people. So don't deny that. That is definitely true. We come from different backgrounds. We all come from different ethnic groups, families, etc. Although we are created equal, that's not the same as saying all are created the same. My friends, please hear me when I say that, because I see massive confusion when people are deriving the term of equity, saying we all are created the same. Therefore, we all need to end at the same place. No, that's false. That premise to that conclusion is false. It's inconsistent. we're all created equal. We will all have equal opportunity, but that does not mean that we are all created the same to have equal outcomes. Each one of us is created uniquely and differently. We are not all the same, and therefore it is feasibly impossible to make everyone end up in the same place. So as Christians, that form of equity we do not support. When they're trying to say we're all the same and we need to all be given unfairly distributed certain resources so that we can end at the same place. That is not the role of government or anyone to do that in society. Matter of fact, if you think about it, who does determine then what is fair and unfair? Like, who decides that's an inequity, and then who decides to take from people who have something to give to somebody who doesn't have something so that person can end where that person has arrived? Does that make sense? I mean, if you think about somebody who's fortunate today, they were once less fortunate, right? Did they steal from somebody who was fortunate to get to where they are today? Well, if so, then that's an injustice. But that's what equity does. At some point, you have to do something unfair to make it fair. You have to take from someone who's worked hard to achieve something to give to somebody who has not worked hard to achieve something, but to give it to them so they can achieve the same status as the person who worked hard. That, my friends, is an injustice. The equitable posture is the classic fair share philosophy, you guys, that has its roots in socialism. The idea here is to mistreat the fortunate in order to treat the less fortunate fairly. But again, the question is how is that just and fair? So that, my friends, addresses this first point that we have to make when it comes to equitable treatment and saying, no, it's an inadequate treatment, which leads now to the second point, false outcomes, when it comes to this position that the progressive left has about equity. The truth is, you guys, equity, according to a progressive ideological viewpoint, doesn't promote fairness. Just look at it. They even admit, the Winston-Salem University even admits that in other definitions. And I'm going to give you guys some examples in a minute of the inconsistencies, the false outcomes, etc., from a progressive point of view of equity. It doesn't promote fairness. It doesn't promote equal opportunities. Therefore, it actually does not lead to equal outcomes. Matter of fact, what this form of equity does, you guys, is it snubs individuality. It stifles creativity. It cheapens competition. It steals from hard-earning workers. It lowers the standards of achievement, and it actually advances partiality. And oftentimes, catch this, it even promotes racism. Just look at White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, a white feminist professor who, in her book, says, don't sympathize and try to feel sorry for black people and speak on their behalf as though you know something that they've gone through if you're white. That's white privilege. And yet, who's writing the book about that? Who's telling you about that? A white educated person. She basically says I have appointed myself as a white educated person to speak on behalf of the African American community because they're not smart enough to speak this way. But I'm helping them. That's why I'm doing this. That, you guys, is an inequity. She's gotten to a certain status who then tells us how we need to accept and approve of her status so she can tell us what equity really is. And yet at the same time, as we need to be treating a certain group of people a certain way, you start mistreating another group because they are more fortunate, or they put the term privilege. So, but who defines the term privilege? So these are scary issues, you guys. So the problem is when you go back to this sample, this meme, to define and show you visually equity, what equity is, here is a rebuttal to that. Of course, there's so many more that you can check out on the internet. But capitalism says, no, this actually, from the equality standpoint, equity standpoint, they're cheating. They're robbing from this baseball organization by not paying for tickets and illegally watching the game. Capitalism puts the wall up, a fence up, and says, buy your own tickets, freeloaders. Because, you guys, the issue here that we're seeing is you have to do something unfair to make things fair. That is wrong. In his book, prosperity and poverty. Calvin Beisner proves this point. Notice what he says. He says, the only way to arrive at equal fruits. So let me put this thing up again. This mean that we are seeing. Let me put this definition. It's going back to premier talent partners. Justice according to natural law or right. The problem is, Calvin Beisner says, is the only way to arrive at equal fruits is to equalize behavior. And that requires robbing men of liberty, making them slaves. So are you really treating people the same in the pursuit of equality, according to Premier Talent Partners? The answer to that is absolutely not. Now, I want to give a shout out. As I was preparing for this video, I ran across a great blog by a guy named Neil Harden. So good job, Neil, if you're watching this video. Notice what he says. Listen closely. He writes, in order for total uniformity of results to be achieved, there would have to be a uniformity of our characteristics and desires. In other words, true equality of outcome could only result if there are no meaningful differences among human beings or the choices we would make, which seems to go completely contrary to the diversity which God intended in creation. Clearly, on some level, God created us with these diverse characteristics and desires, expecting different outcomes, end quote. Here's the bottom line, and this is why I believe this view of equity is from the doctrine of demons, according to 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. God made us unique. God made us different, but we are the same in human nature because we're made in his image. So we are all equal in our nature. No one's superior than the other. But the problem with this form of equity is it's saying the opposite of that. That's saying we have to be the same, so we have the same outcomes. But that's not what God intended. So the reality is, you guys, is to ignore each person's uniqueness, giftedness, is actually not to embrace diversity. And again, in itself, if you take equity in this form from the progressive left, if left unchecked, it leads to more discrimination and oppression. Now let's look at the third point, and let's look at some inconsistencies. I'm going to give you 3 primary examples of equity. Let's take the first one, and let's look at BLM. BLM says that they stand with not just Black lives that matter, but yes, many of them would say that all lives matter. There's a lot in that group who don't believe that. But if they are for equity, then why aren't they standing with Israel? Israel happens to be, you guys, if you look at it in history, and I'm not making this up, historically speaking, they are the most mistreated ethnic group and religious group in history. When you look at it geographically, of how much land Israel has versus how much the Middle East, they are surrounded by Muslims. Hamas is being funded, who's sending rockets into Israel right now, by Russia. They want to see the destruction of Israel. And so Black Lives Matter says in a tweet recently, they stand in solidarity with the Palestinians. And they go even further and say, we, BLM, are a movement committed to ending settler colonialism in all forms and will continue to advocate for Palestinian liberation, always have and always will. And then they put the hashtag Free Palestine. That's inconsistent. Israel has been more oppressed than the people that BLM is supporting in historical contexts. They have been bullied. They have gone through genocide on countless times in different war periods. They've been kicked out of their land. We have anti-Semitic people who are front and center on social media right now addressing these issues of how much they hate Israel and how we need to destroy Israel from the planet. How is that equitable coming from BLM? Let me give you a second example. What about female athletes who have XX chromosomes that are losing to transgender athletes who have XY chromosomes? Just because a man identifies as a woman doesn't give that person a right. This is not equitable. This is inequality in equitable treatment to women because they're being placed at a disadvantage. So where's the equity in that? How are we supporting women who are competing against a transgender athlete who's dominating their sport? You guys, that's an inequity. Third example, you've heard of Mayor Lightfoot of Chicago, right? Lovely woman, it seems. kind of crazy and wacky with some of the teachings she has out there. She's a black woman who, in the spirit of equity, she says that she is only giving interviews to black and brown journalists in celebration of her 2 years in office. Say what? How is that being fair while discriminating against white journalists? Not to mention, is that equitable journalism? Is that objective journalism? You see what inequity does? Not only is it mistreating a certain group of people, you have to mistreat white journalists, and including Asian journalists in there. For black and brown journalists, that's being subjective as well. The outcome of these interviews is not going to be objective. They're going to be subjective on the premise of them being a certain color. So you mistreat a certain group of people based on assumptions so that you can supposedly treat people who have been mistreated by these people. So now we of a certain color can mistreat somebody of a different color because those people of a different color mistreated people of my color. That, my friends, is an injustice. That, my friends, is inequitable treatment. According to Mayor Lightfoot and others from the camp of the left, they say equity is all about systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals. But in practice, see, that's in theory. But in practice, what are we seeing? A mistreatment, partiality. Systematic fairness? No, is systemic racism coming from them. Matter of fact, I throw another challenge out to the transgender people, to the BLM people, and to people like Mayor Lightfoot, who believes what she's doing is equitable. Why the need then to have lists of all fortunate and less fortunate individuals if we're to impartially treat all of them the same? But you just admitted that they're not the same. And to try to get them the same, you have to mistreat one group to treat the other person equitably. That's false, you guys. That is an injustice. Individual freedom doesn't guarantee equal outcomes. However, it does provide equal opportunity. That's the kind of equity Christians should support, which leads me to my fourth and final point in this whole issue of equity, is biblical equity. The Hebrew word for equity in the Jewish scriptures is a Hebrew word, meserim. Now, the meaning of meserim, that's equity, that's used in scripture, is very broad. And it does convey forms of uprightness when you see the uses of it, fairness. It has a concept of justice in relation to a standard of levelness and straightness. So there are some terminologies from biblical equity that you do see the culture uses. But the thing is, when you look at the Bible, when it comes to biblical equity, you see consistency, not an inconsistency. You see adequate treatment, not an inadequate treatment. And let me show you a powerful verse that puts this in context in Proverbs chapter 2, verses 6 and following. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you. Understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil. For men of perverted speech who forsake the paths of uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in the doing evil and delight in the perversiveness of evil. Men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways, end quote. Now, why do I bring up that verse? I bring it up for several reasons. Because notice, equity, biblical equity, exposes, okay, as you have this understanding to guard yourself, and you have the discretion, you have this knowledge, and you have this wisdom, and you understand what is righteousness and what is justice and equity, you're able to know the evil paths. You're able to know perverted speech. You're able to forsake the paths of people who lead you to the ways of darkness. You're not going to go into perversity. You guys, you're not going to mistreat people when you're saying that you're here to treat people the same. You're not a liar. That's biblical equity. That's proper righteousness and justice. And so, guys, as I end this video, and I appreciate you guys watching if you stayed up to this point, The more America moves further away from God and His truth, the deeper our nation will slip into spiritual corruption and as a result, will generate more inequalities and inequities within our society. When the culture measures human rights based on color and ethnicity and socioeconomical status, that culture will not survive. As Christians, we are to honor the fact that each human is made in the image of God, and therefore we are all created equal. I love what the apologist Steve Wagner says, quote, "There is one equal quality among all valuable human beings, human nature." And that's what I've been telling you guys throughout this video. We need to remember that God has made each one of us diverse in color and in ethnicity and in our personalities. And we need to learn to appreciate the uniqueness and difference in each one of us. Our nation was founded on the strong conviction that equality of humanity retains and sustains the essence of human rights in a civil society. But if our natural rights were not exercised in accordance to the natural order, they would be abused beyond its unnatural limitations. And that's exactly what you and I are seeing, my friends, happening from the progressive left as they're enforcing this false ideology about equity. And so I hope this video has been very informative to you as you keep standing strong, my friends, and that you do not buy into the false views of equity from the left. God bless you guys, and until next time, keep standing strong.